Hello, my name is Cher Grieving, and this is my case study for EDL 853, Special Education for School Leaders. We're going to start off in this case study with Category 1, which is Problem Identification and Analysis. What do I know? After reading the case study, I know that we're talking about a special education teacher, Mrs. Susan Green, who is right out of college teaching special education for her first year in a school district that houses K-12, a comprehensive school district that houses K-12. She is replacing a veteran teacher in special education of 25 plus years who seemed to be very well liked and respected. We're also talking about the classroom teacher, Nancy Taylor, who is a third grade teacher. She has 10 years of experience, and she too is very well liked and respected within the school district. The student we are talking about is Carl Hughes. He is diagnosed with a behavior disorder. He has recently been reported as hurting himself and hurting property and hurting others. In the past, he was just hurting himself. He is now disrespecting property and people. However, records report that he has no problems with his intellectual functioning, which means that he is performing academically at grade level. His parents are Mrs. Hughes and Mr. Hughes, who are recently divorced. They have joint custody. They also have 2 other children with disorders. We have the administration, the superintendent and assistant superintendent, who seem to be supportive of Mrs. Green, the special education teacher. What do I need to know? I feel like I need to know what Carl's performance may have been in first and second grades. What was his relationship with his former teachers? What kind of performance did he have in the classroom during his first couple years of school? I want to know the history of his IEP. When was he initially evaluated? When was he staffed in? What kind of goals were they working on in first and second grade? What does his progress report data look like? What kind of services did they provide? Was he previously on a behavior plan? I want to know the record of his behavior referrals to the office. I want to know that if he has been referred for behavior to the principal. If so, what kinds of consequences did the principal dish out? What was the effectiveness of these consequences, if there were any? And I also want to know his profile, what Carl likes to do outside of school. I want to know his strengths and weaknesses, his likes and dislikes, and any extracurricular activities he's involved in. We're going to identify the problem at this time. First of all, Carl is becoming more aggressive and abusive in school, in his third grade classroom. His teacher in third grade no longer wants to have him in her classroom. After approaching the special education teacher, the plan was to form a behavior plan which would remove Carl from the third grade classroom only when his behavior was out of hand. Although the third grade teacher was not completely on board with that, they went ahead, had a meeting to change what was in the IEP. His mother became very emotional, placed blame on the husband, on herself, and the dad just seemed very distracted, like he needed to be, he did not have time for this issue. The administration seemed supportive, but it kind of bothered me that they asked the special education teacher to handle the situation, schedule the meeting, that the superintendent couldn't be there, but the assistant superintendent would come in and sign the IEP, kind of like they were involved but didn't want to be too involved. So now I'm going to start talking as if I were the administrator in this case. First of all, what do I need? Category 2, steps to resolve the problem. I need records. I need journal keeping, and I need documentation. I want to know when his on-task and off-task behavior takes place. I want to know what's happening during that time, what subject they may be studying, what time of day it is, who's in the room. I'm also going to ask Mrs. Taylor to help keep documentation. I feel like I need to bring her on board. Not that we're working without her or behind her back, but I want her to keep documentation to see if she can make any connections with Carl's behavior. I want to schedule Carl for some sessions with our school counselor or social worker. I want him to be able to go somewhere where he feels non-threatened, a non-threatening environment where he feels safe, where he can just kind of let his hair down and talk to someone about his issues. Not that this person's going to scold him or tell him what he needs to do differently. Maybe between the two of them they can set some goals to work on. I want additional testing. I want to double check Carl's reading and math scores to make sure that he hasn't fallen behind in one of those subjects, because that certainly could increase and escalate behavior. I want to establish a plan with a reward system. I want to call him into my office to help establishing a relationship with Carl, asking him what he would like to work towards, what he wants out of school. I want to be able to review appropriate actions with Carl, maybe model. And I also want to involve Mrs. Taylor again to make sure if she could be the person giving out the reward, then that would be a step towards resolving this issue, if she could be the good person. I also know that effective communication with everything that I do is important between the teacher, special education teacher, the counselor, and the parents. And if we need to schedule a meeting to change the IEP again, we can. Again, with Category 2, my strategies to implement this plan, I'm going to communicate again with all involved, especially if I'm going to be in the classroom observing. Mrs. Taylor needs to know, the special education teacher needs to know. I'm going to explain to Mrs. Taylor why I want her documentation to bring her on board. I want to review student and family history, Carl's family history, with the counselor and the social worker. And even Mrs. Taylor, she might be on a need-to-know basis, educational need-to-know basis. But they need to know that his parents are just recently divorced. They're fighting. The mom's very emotional at this time. The dad seems to be disconnected. He's going between house to house. I also want to inform the parents of what we're doing. If it's just a simple email, doesn't have to be anything formal, but just a simple email, just out of courtesy. And then finally, I want to work on establishing a relationship of trust, not only with Carl, but also with his parents, and also trying to bring Mrs. Taylor and Mrs. Green together so we can work as a team. Category 3, what is best for Carl and other students when I'm trying to resolve this problem? I need to consider the least restrictive environment for Carl. Where is the best place for him to be? And this is not just my decision. This is the IEP team decision. Mrs. Green, Mrs. Taylor, myself, the parents, the counselor, we need to decide where he is the safest and he's going to have the most learning take place. I need to consider the safety for all the students and teachers at the same time. Does Carl's behavior impede his learning? When he's in the classroom and he's misbehaving, is he impeding his learning? Do we need to get him out? But more importantly, maybe, is he impeding the learning of others? Because it really just isn't about Carl at this point. If he's disrupting the classroom, then we're impeding the learning of others. Category 4, when I debrief the problem, what am I thinking, feeling, and valuing? First of all, I'm considering the legal steps when dealing with this student, Carl. If he has an IEP, there's things that I need to really work with the special education teacher and make sure that we're taking into account the legal steps. We can't just do what we want, what we think is right for the day, what we feel is right. We have to follow the steps and the services that are written and supposed to be provided in that plan. If we change it, we have to have a meeting to change it. I'm considering and thinking about valuing the safety of all involved. I am considering the safety and well-being of Carl. Again, we need to work on positive, trustworthy relationships with all involved and teamwork between Mrs. Green and Mrs. Taylor. And finally, I need to be available and visible. If I'm going to work to form those relationships, I need to be available to talk. I need to be visible so they know that I'm really on board and really working on this issue. In Category 4, what issues are still unresolved and open to further discussion? I feel like an unresolved issue is Mrs. Taylor and Mrs. Green. Can they work together cooperatively? Will Mrs. Taylor allow Carl into her classroom with a behavior plan implemented? I haven't really talked about the plan. I do like Mrs. Green's plan of putting Carl in and pulling him out when he is disruptive, but we have to take everything in consideration. Will Carl's parents work cooperatively to help support? A lot of times if we're working hard at school to support this child and they go home to a non-supportive environment, everything we've done goes backwards. It's like one step forward, two steps back. At what point do we pull Carl from the classroom? If the behavior plan is not effective, do we seriously need to consider pulling him to the resource room full time? But that's a decision between all of us, not just me, not just Mrs. Green, not just Mrs. Taylor. In category 5, I'm going to talk about how I feel like I will promote academic success and personal well-being for Carl by doing what I've done. First of all, I will remain consistent and fair with all students and staff. I feel like that's important. Academic success and personal well-being doesn't happen if you don't have a leader who's consistent and fair, and one that also models. I need to model effective communication. If you don't have a leader that is keeping everyone in the loop on an educational need-to-know basis, not keeping secrets or hiding anything, one that's going to be talking out loud, I feel like that will promote success. I will practice confidentiality and remain professional, and I will work to establish that trustworthy relationship. So you can tell some things that I really feel strongly about is communication and relationships. Component 1 of category 5, how do I feel like I promoted just the academic success for this student? The IEP team will review his scores and deliver appropriate instruction and curriculum for Carl. We will determine the least restrictive environment for Carl throughout the day. We will consider supports in the form of modifications and accommodations, even inclusion support with a paraeducator in the classroom for Carl if needed. This will give Mrs. Taylor some relief. And also, we need to establish appropriate goals for Carl and keep the progress monitored and communicated. Category 5, component 2, how do I feel like I promoted the personal well-being for Carl? In this case, I feel like if I remain sensitive to Carl's background and family history, I will gain that trust from him. I will push for continued counseling services for his personal well-being and possibly his younger siblings if we're going to have those in the classroom and in the special education room also. I will work to gain trust, and I will communicate all of Carl's needs. Finally, component 3 of category 5, how did I enhance instructional capacity? In my picture here, I feel like we're putting the puzzle together. We're finally putting the last place in. I'm going to enhance instructional capacity by building relationships, encouraging teamwork, remaining fair and consistent, gathering data, form a plan from that data, and finally provide positive reinforcements and support for the teachers. They are the ones who are with Carl all day. I get to come in and help, but they are the ones that need the support. In conclusion, I feel like decisions must be made with the student's best interest in mind. The classroom teacher doesn't always feel like they probably get the better end of the deal when this happens, but it's really what needs to happen for the student's best interest. Not everyone will agree, but the biggest reward is watching this student come back beyond high school who is a productive, responsible citizen and maybe say to you, thank you for the support and thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for watching. That's all.